When they stepped into the forest, the silence was immediate and unnerving. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet you find in nature. It was a dead, suffocating void. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves. Just the heavy stillness, as if the forest itself was listening, waiting for them to make a mistake. The idea to visit Blackthorn Forest had been Sarah's. A self-proclaimed adventurer, she had heard about the forest's strange reputation through an online forum, stories of vanished hikers, eerie carvings, and a silence so deep it felt alive had only fueled her curiosity. "It's just folklore," she had assured her friends. "Nothing but exaggerated campfire tales." Emma, Jake, and Liam were skeptical but eventually gave in. They had spent years chasing cheap thrills together: haunted houses, abandoned asylums, urban legends. Blackthorn seemed like just another box to check off their list. Besides, Sarah's enthusiasm was contagious, and a weekend away from the monotony of city life seemed like a good idea. Their journey began in high spirits. They joked and sang along to the radio as they drove into the wilderness. But as the road narrowed and the towering trees of Blackthorn Forest came into view, their laughter faded. The trees stood unnaturally still, their gnarled branches twisting into shapes that looked almost human. A wooden sign marked the forest's entrance. "Beware, do not enter." Sarah laughed nervously. "They really went all out with the spooky vibe, huh?" she said. Liam, trying to lighten the mood, quipped, "It's like something out of a low-budget horror movie." But no one laughed. They crossed the threshold, and the change was immediate. The air grew colder, heavier. The usual sounds of a forest, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves were absent. Even their footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive silence. They found a clearing and set up camp, trying to shake off the unease. As they worked, Emma noticed something strange. The bark of the surrounding trees was covered in carvings. Distorted faces, their mouths open in silent screams. She called the others over, but Sarah dismissed it as vandalism, the work of bored teens. Still, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the faces were watching her. By nightfall, the tension was palpable. The fire crackled in the center of their campsite, its warm light casting long, flickering shadows. They sat around it, trying to lift their spirits with ghost stories and snacks. But every so often, someone would glance over their shoulder, as if expecting to see something or someone in the darkness beyond. "Let's explore tomorrow," Sarah suggested, her voice breaking the uneasy silence. "We came here for an adventure, right?" The others nodded hesitantly, though none of them felt as confident as they had a few hours ago. That night, Jake was the first to hear it. A whisper, faint and distant, carried on the cold night air. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but then it came again, closer, clearer. "Jake!" The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent chills down his spine. He sat up, his flashlight in hand, and stepped outside the tent. The whisper stopped. The forest stood still, its shadows long and menacing. Jake's flashlight beams swept across the trees, revealing nothing but the twisted carvings on their bark. Shaking his head, he muttered, "Get a grip, man," and went back inside. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The morning light brought no comfort. The silence was even heavier in the daylight, as though the forest resented their presence. They ate breakfast quickly, eager to distract themselves by exploring the area. Sarah took charge, her excitement undiminished despite the strange stillness of the forest. "Let's see what's out there," she said, forcing a smile. The others followed, their apprehension growing with every step. As they moved deeper into the woods, the forest seemed to shift around them. The trees stood impossibly tall, their branches so dense that they blocked out much of the sunlight. Emma kept looking over her shoulder, her unease growing with each passing minute. "Doesn't this feel off to anyone else?" she asked. Jake shrugged, trying to mask his nervousness. "It's just a forest. Creepy, sure, but it's not like it's haunted." They walked for hours, weaving through narrow paths and stepping over roots that seemed to rise from the ground like skeletal fingers. Then they came upon a clearing, and the sight stopped them in their tracks. The clearing was littered with shoes, hundreds of them, old, rotting, covered in moss and dirt. There were boots, sneakers, even a child's small, tattered sandal. But there was no sign of people, no indication of where the owners might have gone. "What the hell is this?" Liam muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah crouched to examine a pair of boots. "It's like they just left them here," she said, her voice tinged with unease. Emma pointed to a rusted watch lying in the dirt, its hands frozen at 12:03. The scene was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. "We should go back," Emma said, her voice trembling. But when they turned to retrace their steps, the path they had taken was gone. "What the?" Jake spun around, his eyes wide. The trees had moved, their trunks impossibly close together, forming an impenetrable wall. The way they had come was now a dense thicket of branches and shadows. Panic began to set in. Liam grabbed Sarah's arm. "This isn't funny. Did you bring us here just to scare us?" Sarah shook her head, her confidence faltering. "I didn't do this. How could I?" The group tried to stay calm, but every attempt to find a way out led them back to the clearing of shoes. It was as if the forest was toying with them, steering them back to the place it wanted them to be. As the day wore on, the oppressive silence began to take a toll. The lack of sound was maddening, an unnatural void that made every whisper of wind or snap of a twig feel deafening. Emma kept looking at the trees, convinced she saw movement in the shadows. "Someone's out there," she whispered. "You're imagining things," Jake said. Though he wasn't so sure himself, he thought he'd seen something too. A flicker of motion, a flash of pale light, but every time he turned to look, there was nothing. By late afternoon, they were exhausted, their nerves frayed. They sat in a circle near the clearing, trying to come up with a plan. "We should stay put," Sarah said. "If we keep moving, we'll just get more lost." Emma shook her head. "We can't stay here. What if it gets dark?" It was then that they noticed Emma wasn't holding her scarf anymore. "Where's your scarf?" Jake asked. Emma's hand flew to her neck, her face pale. I must have dropped it," she stammered. They retraced their steps to where Emma thought she'd had it last. As they neared a twisted tree, they saw the scarf dangling from a low branch. But something was wrong. The scarf was wet, soaked in a dark, sticky substance. Emma reached for it, but Jake stopped her. "Don't touch it," he said, his voice low. The wind picked up suddenly, a sharp gust that rustled the leaves for the first time since they had arrived. It was the only sound they had heard all day, and it sent chills down their spines. "What the hell is going on here?" Liam demanded, his voice cracking. No one had an answer, but as the wind died down, the silence returned, heavier than before. And for the first time, they all felt it. Something was watching them. Night descended on the forest faster than they anticipated, swallowing the remaining daylight in a suffocating darkness. The group huddled together near the remnants of their campfire, which sputtered weakly against the cold air. The silence, once unsettling, now felt alive, pulsing, pressing down on them, as though the forest itself was drawing closer. "We need to keep moving," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Sitting here is just giving it, whatever it is, more time." "No," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. "We move, and we'll lose each other like we lost Emma." The mention of Emma's name brought a heavy stillness over the group. No one wanted to admit it, but they all knew she was gone, swallowed by the forest. Yet, deep down, they felt her presence, as if the forest had absorbed her essence, keeping her close to taunt them. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance, just beyond the clearing. It was cold and unnatural, a bluish glow that seemed to hover in the air. Liam stood, pointing. "Do you see that? Maybe it's someone who can help us." Jake grabbed Liam's arm. "No, don't you think it's strange? There's no one out here but us." "But what if it's Emma?" Liam insisted, pulling away. Before anyone could stop him, he stumbled toward the light, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Liam, don't," Sarah called, but it was too late. He disappeared into the thicket, the glow fading with him. Jake and Sarah ran after him, their feet crunching on the brittle leaves and frost-covered ground. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and shifting in the darkness. Shadows moved at the edge of their vision, darting between the trunks like predators circling their prey. They found Liam standing in a small clearing, staring up at a massive, hollow tree. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, its bark blackened as though scorched by fire. A faint blue light seeped from within, illuminating Liam's wide, terrified eyes. "What are you doing?" Jake demanded, grabbing Liam's shoulder. Liam didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on something inside the tree. Jake and Sarah followed his line of sight and saw it. An old, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded. The blue glow seemed to emanate from the book itself. Sarah hesitated, but Jake reached inside and pulled it free. The moment his fingers touched the journal, the forest seemed to shudder. A low, guttural sound echoed through the trees, a sound that wasn't quite human. Jake opened the journal, its brittle pages filled with frantic, scrawled handwriting. The entries described the forest as a living entity, one that thrived on fear and despair. Victims who entered were hunted, their souls consumed and turned into shadows to stalk the next prey. The final entry was written in shaky, uneven letters. "You can't escape. It won't let you." A sudden, piercing scream shattered the silence. They turned to see Liam's face contorted in agony, his body frozen in place. From behind him, shadowy tendrils emerged, wrapping around his limbs and pulling him toward the hollow tree. "Liam!" Sarah screamed, rushing toward him, but Jake held her back. "You can't help him," he yelled. Liam's eyes locked onto theirs for a brief moment, filled with terror and pleading, before the shadows consumed him. His scream cut off abruptly, leaving only the suffocating silence. Jake and Sarah ran, the journal clutched tightly in Jake's hand. The forest seemed to come alive around them, the trees bending and twisting, their branches clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. "Keep going," Jake shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But Sarah stumbled, falling to her knees. "I can't," she sobbed. "It's too late." "No, get up." Jake grabbed her arm, but she pulled away. "You go," she whispered, her voice filled with resolve. Before Jake could protest, Sarah turned and faced the darkness. "Come and get me, you bastard," she screamed, her voice echoing through the forest. The shadows surged toward her, a mass of writhing darkness that swallowed her whole. Jake hesitated for a moment, his heart breaking, before he turned and ran, the sound of Sarah's screams fading into the silence. Jake ran blindly through the forest, clutching the journal like a lifeline. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his legs burned with every step. The forest seemed to shift and twist around him, the path ahead constantly changing. The trees loomed taller, their branches weaving into unnatural shapes that reached out like claws. The shadows were no longer subtle. They moved with purpose, closing in from every direction. He didn't know how long he'd been running when he finally saw it. The edge of the forest, just beyond the final line of trees, the faint glow of their car's headlights pierced the darkness. Relief washed over him, giving him the strength to push forward. "I'm almost out," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. As he reached the tree line, Jake slowed. Something felt off. The oppressive silence that had followed him through the forest now seemed heavier, almost suffocating. He turned back to look into the woods, and his heart sank. Figures stood in the shadows, vague, human-like shapes that seemed to flicker and shift, as if they were part of the forest itself. Among them, he recognized Emma, Liam, and Sarah. Their faces were pale and twisted with anguish, their eyes empty and glowing faintly. They didn't move, but their presence was enough to root Jake in place. "Why are you stopping?" he muttered to himself. "It's not real. Keep going." But as he took a step forward, Emma's voice echoed softly from the darkness. "Jake, don't leave us." He froze. Her voice was distorted, as if it came from underwater, but it was unmistakably hers. "Emma?" he whispered, turning to face the shadows. The figures remained still, but the whispering began. It wasn't just Emma anymore. It was Liam, Sarah, and countless other voices, all calling his name, begging him to stay. The sound grew louder, surrounding him, drilling into his mind. Jake stumbled backward, shaking his head. "No, you're not real. You're not real," he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling, guttural laugh. Jake turned toward the car, his heart pounding, and started running. He was only a few steps away when he felt it, a sudden, icy weight pulling at him. Looking down, he saw his shadow stretching unnaturally long across the ground. It moved independently, writhing like a living thing. Before he could react, it began to rise, twisting and coiling around him. "No!" Jake screamed, thrashing against the shadow's grip. It was cold, like the grave, and impossibly strong. He clawed at the air, desperate to free himself, but the shadow only tightened its hold. As it pulled him back toward the forest, he saw the figures in the shadows move for the first time. They stepped forward, their faces filled with sorrow. Sarah reached out a hand, her expression a mixture of pain and resignation. "It's easier if you don't fight," she whispered. Jake shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not staying here. I'm not like you." The shadow pulled harder, dragging him into the darkness. The last thing he saw before the forest swallowed him was the car's headlights flickering and fading, as if the forest itself was erasing any trace of his existence. Days later, back in the nearest town, a hiker stumbled across the group's abandoned car. There was no sign of the campers, but something about the car felt wrong. Cold, untouched, as if it had been there for years. That night, Liam sat in his apartment, staring out his window. He had made it out, or at least he thought he had. But as he looked at the reflection in the glass, his blood turned to ice. Emma's face stared back at him, her eyes hollow and her hand pressed against the window. Behind her, the dark outline of Blackthorn Forest loomed, its twisted branches forming a skeletal frame. "Come back," she whispered, her voice barely audible, and then she was gone.